Wherever you are, my name is Scott Dannemiller, and I'm the president of Lifework Associates. And I'm glad to be here with you. I've been doing leadership development, a lot in the corporate world and also the nonprofit sector for the last 25 plus years. At the same time, I'm honored to be here with you for your event. I was hoping that we could be together in a big room where we could actually see, touch, have a nice handshake and a good laugh and breathe on each other. But as the pandemic rages on, it's not an option. But I'm glad that we can be together in this virtual space. And today, our topic is on navigating tough conversations. A bit of logistics before we get too deep, and I'll share this with you. You should have in front of you. If you don't have it, that's okay. But you should have received a handout. Looks like this, Navigating Tough Conversations. And this will be helpful as we go through our time together. There's some examples in here and some takeaways for you, even a place on the last couple pages to make some notes. But the Navigating Tough Conversations document should be there for you and helpful to have. If you don't have it, keep watching. It's going to be fine. And also, in setting context for this, I'm sure some of you are wondering, navigating tough conversations, why is this the topic? And we have to look at society today and say, it seems polarized. It seems like there's a lot of arguing, fighting. You're either on one side or the other of some issue. And we wonder, how can we get past this? And what has happened that's caused this? And it's nice in these moments to just remind ourselves, it's always been this way. And there are people that tend to be really good at managing these polarized situations where people may be on opposite sides of an issue or a decision. And there are others who may not be as skilled at that. And the intent today is to give us some strategies and tools so that when we encounter these situations, especially in our churches, that we can navigate them. And as you know, it's nothing new in churches. If we just read the book of Acts, you can only imagine that there were probably some strong debates whenever, for example, they were trying to decide, all right, what's it take to be a true Christian? Do you need to be circumcised or not? I'm guessing that people likely had some strong opinions and were just, oh, yeah, that sounds fine. Yeah, if that's what it takes, I'll do that. Our debates are nothing new, and they're not going to go away. But there's a lot that we can do to manage these difficult situations, and that's where we will start today. And I'll share some material with you. I'll share some stories and examples. And by the end of this, I'll share some questions with you that you can carry forward into your roundtable discussions to talk about how do we apply the things that we'll be discussing today. And it's really about establishing a foundation for success. Now, if you do have your handout in front of you, if you turn to page 1, and here, if you look at our slides, it says page 1. I'll try to keep us all on track. Take a moment to identify your own tough conversation. And if we define that further, tough conversation is anywhere where there are differences of opinion, where emotions could be strong, and it's imperative that the conversation goes well. And when I say goes well, it means we can walk away from this conversation with our relationships intact. And this doesn't have to be a church-related conversation, a congregation-related conversation, a church staff-related conversation. It could be with a leader, a staff, a member of the congregation, kids, spouses, neighbors. It doesn't matter if it falls into this category. So I'll ask you to pause right now, if you want to pause the video, and just write down, what is the tough conversation? Who are you having this conversation with? And what's the topic? So take a moment for that. Welcome back. Before we talk much about these tough conversations, I'll share an example with you. When I'm working with organizational leaders, there's an exercise I like to go through. We call it the coconut crisis, and it's a role play. And one of the people in the role play is Chris, and the other person is Lee. And Chris works for a cosmetics company and Lee works for an automotive company. And when each person reads their role, they learn that for their company, their organization, they are after one thing and one thing only. There is a crop of 4,000 coconuts on a remote island, and it's the Mali Mali coconut, and they're very important. And there's only 4,000 of them. And both Chris and Lee need all of these coconuts to accomplish an objective. Now, Chris, he uses the Mali Mali coconut to make a special cream, and that cream is used to save burn victims, primarily children. Lee, on the other hand, uses this Mali Mali coconut to make an injection, and that injection heals paralysis victims. Now, unbeknownst to both Chris and Lee, they know what their objective is, but all they know about the other individual is that they also want these coconuts, and they work for either the automotive or the cosmetics company. So you can imagine both these people, they enter into this conversation thinking this is a slam dunk. I'm here to either save burn victims or save paralysis victims. And this other person, what are they making? Some skin cream, or what are they making for an automotive company? Brake pads? Why do they need these coconuts? And so they enter into this conversation with, well, as you might imagine, a bit of skepticism. And then once they start to advocate for their position or find out a bit more, they're all taken aback when they realize, all right, what may have started as a negotiation with skepticism now is something we need to work toward compromise, because both of our points of view are important. Now, here's where we need to take a mental pause and say, how does this relate to our normal tough conversations? In any conversation, negotiation, debate, the importance of my need, the relative importance, is in the eye of the beholder. No matter who I am, my needs are important. And so if we start these conversations trying to prove that our need is more important, we are bound to lose. I'll say that again. If we enter into these conversations trying to advocate that our need, our position is more important, we are bound to lose, because the relative importance depends on your perspective. But in these conversations, people tend to try to work toward a compromise. And 80% of the people that participate in this, on average, negotiate some sort of split. They're like, okay, both of us want something important. So we're both after 4,000 coconuts each, but there's only 4,000 total. So how about this? You take 2,000, I take 2,000, and we talk about how do we, work with the islanders to grow more coconuts or something like that. They get creative. But when they walk away from this conversation, what they realize is that the relationship is preserved, but neither person got really what they wanted or needed out of this. But there are 20% of the people, when they enter into this conversation, they find a win-win in here. But it's a fairly rare occurrence. So what is the win-win that's baked in here? Well, when each person receives their role play, it's not even fine print. It says in one of the paragraphs, you want these coconuts because you're going to build this life-saving either injection or cream, and you want all the coconuts to do that. That's their position when they walk into this. But William Ury of the Harvard Negotiation Project identified this difference in debates, negotiations, the difference between your position and your interest. Your position is what you walk in wanting, but the interest is, what is it you truly need? And in this, we realize, so for Lee, well, what is it you truly need? I want to cure paralysis victims. Well, how do you do that? Well, with a fluid. And well, how do you make the fluid? Well, we make the fluid from the milk of the coconuts. And this is where we start to realize, wait a minute, both people need something different from this coconut. Lee needs the milk. Chris needs the meat to make his cream. And actually, we can share this. There's a way for us to both have our interests or our true needs met without having to debate this. Now, that's not always possible in every conversation that you have, but it's very important to realize that most of us miss these opportunities. Now, how do we get to these interests and identifying what people's true interests are? We say, well, we need to ask questions. Well, not all questions are created equal. When you listen to people debate this, one of the common questions that comes up from Chris in this debate, who saves children with his magical cream, Chris will ask a question. Hey, Lee, I'm curious, do you have kids? I mean, why do we ask that question? That question is only intended to manipulate. Based on the answer to that, Lee says, oh, I do. I have 2 kids. Oh, really, Lee? What are their names? Oh, imagine if little Emma was, right? And if I'm asking questions only to set someone up or paint someone into a corner, it's not truly a curious question. What are the truly curious questions are, what are your needs? And tell me more about that. And if I'm not in that curious spot, we're never going to accomplish our objectives. So that brings us to us now. We are Chris and Lee. And in navigating tough conversations, one thing we need to realize is it's not about the coconuts. It's rarely, if ever, about the coconuts. It's not about the church building project. It's not about what VBS theme we decide to go with. It's not about what are we doing in the narthex. It's not about whether we have contemporary music or not. It's not about those things. It's typically something deeper. It's often about tradition or identity. And if we can't have those conversations, we'll never get past the coconuts, and our compromise, we'll never both get what we want out of that. That's something we need to know. And the second thing is it starts with me. And that's where we'll begin today. Is all the tools and techniques that we could try in these tough conversations to manage them, to navigate them, they can be really helpful. But if I don't start with understanding where I am in these conversations, we're doomed to fail. And the first thing we need to recognize is a lot of the myths that we tend to believe. What are the common misconceptions about polarizing conversations? So I'm going to pull out my paper here so I don't misquote anything. But in an April edition of the Harvard Business Review this year, there was a survey of 700 people that was reported, and they wanted to ask them about these polarizing conversations because people are having to manage polarized workforces now. And when they asked people about disagreements, one of the first misconceptions is that disagreements are bad. When they asked these 700 people, nearly 60% described disagreements at work as moderately to extremely unpleasant. Moderately to extremely unpleasant. About a third of people sought to avoid these conversations, and over 40% thought that disagreements are destructive to relationships. And you may be in that boat. I know I don't like conflict, but where does this myth arise from? This myth arises from the fact that we've likely been involved in disagreements in the past that weren't managed well. And because we experience these results of a damaged relationship or hurt feelings or people not getting what they truly needed, that's how we're going to define disagreements in the future. Now, the second myth that comes up is that these tough conversations, these disagreements, make people feel defensive. All right, let's get underneath this. And what does this mean for us? We tend to go into disagreements believing that the other side won't listen. And we assume the worst about them. A survey done by a group called, and I'm going to get this right, More in Common. They're dedicated to strengthening societies, trying to overcome social division, More in Common. And they found, when they interviewed people, that less than 20% of Democrats, so if we want to find a polarized group here, less than 20% of Democrats agreed with the statement that most police officers are bad people. Less than 20% when they asked to check the box. But the Republicans, when they were asked, what do they think the Democrats would say in response to that question, they estimated that over half of Democrats would agree with that statement, that most police officers are bad people. So we tend to already come in with this polarized mindset. The same could be said of Democrats' perceptions about perhaps Republican feelings about the same statement, like most immigrants are bad people. We tend to mischaracterize others. And when we do this, and then we ask people about their feelings in disagreements, most people, when they're in a disagreement, reported feeling, when these 700 people that were surveyed, angry, irritated, and disgusted in a disagreement. When they were asked, how do you believe the other person felt? They said, oh, I think they felt insecure, anxious, and threatened. I remember myself feeling this way in disagreements. Well, what does that mean? Notice the difference. We don't believe we feel anxious or threatened, but we think others are. And if that's the case for us, we say, gosh, for them, admitting they're wrong, when I'm presenting this evidence to them, for them to admit they're wrong would be too damaging to their ego, would be threatening to their worldview. We tend to tie the other person's argument to their identity. And if we're doing that, we start to feel intellectually superior, don't we? Like, well, we're obviously right. And so they're going to feel threatened by what we present. What about if they're right? Because the follow-up question was, in this argument, do you think you will win or are the right one? And over 75% of the people said yes. All right. It's mathematically impossible for more than 75% of us to win this debate. We already have these misconceptions about the other in these conversations. We just do. And that's because, number three, our brains are this huge pattern recognition and prediction machine. And we're inherently biased creatures. Once we form an opinion, here's what we do. No matter what the issue is, let's say it's do we wear name tags or not? I am going to go seek out and absorb and retain information that supports my worldview. We just do. Our brains are conditioned to do that. And anything that's contrary to what I initially believe, we tend to diminish the importance of it, the credibility, the relevance of that. And so we think that people who disagree with us do so because they're uninformed or unintelligent. And that's not the case. When we're in these disagreements, the problem is we're both very well informed. We're just coming in with different information. And we're missing the full picture. So if we want to change things, we have to change ourselves first. Because when we get into these disagreements, like let's take the coconut crisis, for example, we get what I'll call lost at sea, and C is going to be an acronym for us. The S stands for story. The stories that are in our heads, typically about the other person in any tough conversation, impacts the emotions that we feel. And those emotions then have an impact on our actions. When we take the coconut crisis, we automatically assume this person's selfish. They're going to do whatever it takes to help themselves. And for that reason, I can't really trust them. Are they going to be true? Now, what's interesting is that story led people to withhold information in the role play example I gave you for. They weren't going to share how much money they had to buy these coconuts with. And we tend to perhaps hold on to certain information. Now, this skeptical, anxious feeling, and maybe just a bit angry feeling that I have, leads me to, again, not listen. I might be aggressive. I may tell half-truths. I may try to be passive-aggressive or manipulate someone else. Not because I'm a bad person, but just because that's how my brain dictates how things go. So in order to change this is a pattern that happens. I need to go back to the start. I need to start with that story in my head. Because as much as we want to say this is not us, we have to recognize that there's This is an automatic response of your brain in these tough conversations. Daniel Kahneman, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, developed an understanding of our brain that he calls System 1 and System 2. You can use the analogy of an elephant and a rider. There's part of our brain that is logical, slow, calculating, conscious, it's effortful, but it follows a logical pattern. And there's another part of our brain that's fast, it's emotional, subconscious, automatic, holistic, it's intuitive. That's the elephant. The rider is the slow, logical, calculating, and the elephant is that fast, subconscious, automatic. Now, we'll call the subconscious the elephant. System 1, we're going to call that slow, logical. System 2, the rider. Now, who is in charge? A lot of us think, gosh, the rider's in charge because I'm atop this beast and I can control. Good luck. If you've seen videos, you know that an elephant's going to do what an elephant wants to do, and there's not much you can do to stop it. So here's some examples. Play this game with us. Here's an image. What do you see? Now, many of you say, all right, I see a panda. You don't even have to try to do it. But is a panda really there? Notice it's just some random black splotches that happen to be forming a pattern that your brain fills in the blanks on. And you don't even have to do it. It's happening without you noticing. Like, what do you see here? We see faces. You can't not see it. And here, your brain fills in the gaps, whether you want it to or not. Right? Take a look at this. Read this statement. Well, you're like, how do I read it? It's numbers and no. If you look at it, your brain fills in the blank and says, this message proves how our minds can do amazing things. Impressive, huh? System 1, you can't turn it off. Now, what's not helpful is context of a situation. Our experience in the past guides what we believe to be true. And this is an example, right? We've got this checkerboard and you've got a cylinder here, and the cylinder is casting a shadow. And the question is, these two squares, are they the same color or are they different color? Now your brain, your System 1 brain turns on and goes, they're different colors. They're different colors. But if we look at the squares, they're actually the same color. You're like, wait a minute, that's computer tricks. Look at them again. Are they the same color or different color? Your brain can't forget the context, the shadowy cylinder and what that means, but they're indeed the same. All right, you still don't believe me, right? Let's wipe and move it away a little slow. Let's go more slowly. Looky there. All right, and you're still, this guy's fooling me. He's just, let's do this. All right, now you see those two squares and look at that. System 1 is there, it's automatic, and we can't turn it off. Now, here's what happens is sometimes we're going to run into a situation where that automatic part of our brain won't fill in the blanks for us because it's just too complicated. So this is when System 2 tends to kick in. The rider brain says, okay, I need to be more thoughtful, slow, logical about this. But you have to tell your brain to do this because System 1 is going to jump in. So imagine, and here's an example. Here's a riddle for you. Imagine a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? Most of us, our automatic brain kicks in and says, it says 10 cents. It's 10 cents. The bat and a ball, $1.10. The bat costs $1 more. The ball's 10 cents. But then when we do the math, we say, hold on a second. Actually, if the bat is $1 more, and if the ball costs 10 cents, then the bat costs $1.10. Together, that's $1.20. So that can't be right. The answer is actually 5 cents. Your rider brain has to come in and do that. But even some of you are still going, I mean, we could do the math and really, really mess with your head here, but that just hurts all of our heads anyway. But this is all an example of whether we're doing math, seeing pictures of faces, or engaged in conversations, your brain has an automatic response. And if we want to overcome it, System 1 can't be stopped. So we have to engage the system 2 part of our brain. That's the intentionality in these conversations. So how do we be intentional? Here's our strategies for the tough conversations you may run into. 1, we have to understand our interests, and we talked about what interest and position are, and we'll get into more detail on that. We have to acknowledge our bias in these harmful stories, define what a harmful story is so you can recognize when we get caught in that trap. And then we've got to rewrite that story in our head. We got to go back and not get lost at sea. And a way to do that is to assume positive intent and focus on points of agreement. So let's work on the understanding your interest part. So here's a real world scenario that I'll give you with a real world person. Kurt is a pastor, and here's Kurt's story. And this is on page 3 of your handout. I'm going to grab a little coffee. Maybe you have some too. And so here's what Kurt says. I've been the lone pastor at a small church for 9 months. 2 months ago, our 2 part-time staff members refreshed the weekly newsletter, made some changes to it. Unfortunately, the first newsletter had a number of errors, including a food for thought message that wasn't aligned with the church's overall theology. I let them know what the boundaries were and asked to review the next one before sending. When I did, I noticed similar issues. The deadline was tight, so I revised it myself. Since then, when I check their work, I see similar problems. I now just ask them to submit a week ahead of time to assure it's all good. So I, Kurt, the pastor, can assure it's all good. So there's a tough conversation that needs to happen here. But first, let's get up to the story in our head and examine what are our true interests. So if you want to pause the video right now, there's a couple of questions on page 3 that asks about, what do we think Kurt's position is? How has he positioned his argument, saying, here's what I want? And then what are his true interests? What does he really want, do we think? So pause now, take a moment to jot those things down. And when you start up the video, we'll look at what Kurt said. All right, welcome back. Well, let's see. What did Kurt say? The first question was, what is Kurt's position? And this is when we're in a conversation about the name tags or the music at church or the theme for VBS, or are we going to make a statement about some current event? Take a stand, a position on it. What's our position? What Kurt said in this conversation, his position was this, and it's there in the text for you. All newsletters must be reviewed by me 1 week ahead of time. So that's how he positioned it. Now notice, that may not be a very helpful positioning. This causes a debate, and you can imagine, and I'm going to ask you in a moment, how do you think Kurt's 2 staff members felt about this? Now, what was Kurt's true interest? What is it that you want? Again, if we don't engage system 2 of our brain and start to really think about this, the automatic part gets engaged. So when I asked Kurt, what's your true interest here? What do you really want? I'd be interested to see what you had written down. But my guess is it's something related to this. Kurt said, you know, Scott, what I really want, I just want us to be aligned on the message, like the mission, the theology, the vision of our church. And I want us to produce quality work. It's important to us as an organization. We've been a church for a long time, and we want a mission that we can all be aligned and passionate about, because there's something about a unified group of people all working towards making Jesus' Great Commission a reality. That's so different than, you got to turn this into me a week ahead of time. Notice what happens when we frame these conversations in terms of our interests. The first thing you'll likely notice is, you know what? I bet the 2 staff people, they may not like the idea of turning in something to their boss 1 week ahead of time, all the time. But you know what they probably agree with? Is they also want to be aligned on the message, and they also want to produce quality work. think about if we can start a conversation with our true interests instead of what our positions are, how much more powerful that is. And both of us go into problem solving mode of, okay, so how do we make this interest, which we're much more likely to agree on, how do we make that a reality? And how do we make that live? So now I'll ask you to dive into your own scenario. I asked you to identify one at the start of this program. So if you'd like to pause the video now, the two questions are, what do you want out of this conversation? And then what are your true interests? And what do you think the other person's interests might be? So pause the video, take a moment, and see if when you think about your true interests, are they different than how you're positioning this conversation already? Now that you took a moment to do that, hopefully you did see that there are different ways that we can frame this conversation that starts to change the story in our head. Now, the other thing we need to do, so we're writing the story differently, positioning our conversations differently, but we also have to do this second piece, acknowledge bias and harmful stories. I would love to say, let's eliminate bias in conversation. Guess what? That's impossible. Our biases come from our experience. And unless you want to erase all your experience and your life becomes like you're Karen from the soap opera who had amnesia and can't remember anything, then you'll have no bias. But besides that, we can't do that. So you're going to come in with bias, and let's make those visible. And therefore, others will probably make theirs visible. And let's acknowledge, what are these harmful stories? So, all right, what's a harmful story? Harmful stories. In any conversation, if you've ever heard yourself say one of these things, it's not my fault. You know, I didn't start this. I've done everything that I can. Or I'm coming from a good place. If the only person really understood my intentions, they'd be on my side. Or if you've heard yourself say, it's all your fault, it's all the other person's fault. If they would just see the facts, then doggone it, they'd be on board. They'd be on my side. Another harmful story. We've done everything we can. There's nothing we can do. We just need to make the tough call here. We just need, now, some cases, there is a situation where not everybody can be happy. But if you hear yourself saying one of these three things, that's a sign that we may not be in the right headspace for this. Gosh, and how often with my spouse have I gone into a conversation of, not my fault, not my fault they're upset that I'm leaving dirty dishes in the sink. Like, they just need to realize that we live in this house and dirty dishes happen, right? If this is important to you, why can't I just do the thing, right? And the other time, especially in churches, we will know if we've got a harmful story in our head. If you find yourself thumbing through the scriptures to find the passage that's going to support your side of the argument. If we start proof texting like that, you know, it needs to be in the red letters. If Jesus said it, that's going to trump anything that they said that comes out of the, you know, the Hebrew scriptures. We know we've lost. So acknowledge these harmful stories. Let's go back into Kurt's situation. See if you can identify where they might be. So we heard Kurt's scenario. And when I talked to Kurt, I noticed a lot of harmful stories, the it's not my fault. Here's what Kurt said. He's like, all right, so I took the first newsletter and I revised it and I showed him what to do. And I did to edit it and look at the spell check. And I've even helped them with their work. It's not my fault. Look at all the things that I've done. So somewhat trapped in a story that's going to make it difficult for all of us to move forward. It's all your fault. The other thing I heard Kurt say is, doggone it, it's part of their job description. These two folks are supposed to be able to work autonomously. It's doable given their experience. They've experienced our church's mission and vision. They were part of creating that. And now to have a passage in the newsletter that doesn't really align with that, they're messing up. And then you can hear the exasperation at the end, and I've met with them several times, and either I keep doing the work myself or we cancel the newsletter. Like I hate to do it. It's been a tradition for, wow, okay, we are trapped in these stories. And you'll know you're trapped in your positions if this false dilemma comes up. What a false dilemma is anytime you pose a question, it's an either or. Either I do it myself or we cancel the newsletter. Those are the two choices. There's a whole book called The Third Alternative. Our brains really like yes-no decisions, binary choices like that. Our brains love them. But humanity doesn't, because there's always some other way to do this, because these false dilemmas, these either or choices, rarely take everyone's interests into account and try to get creative about how do we satisfy as many interests as we can. So let's acknowledge our own bias and acknowledge if we're caught in these stories, because if we're caught in these stories, we're not going to succeed unless we get out. So how do we get out? And here are some tactics. We have to rewrite the story in our own head. You don't need to go find new data. We don't need to go, again, find scriptures to support what we say, get a political coalition. If I just have enough people behind me, we'll win this. How can we rewrite our own story? And there's two spots to do this. Now, first one is going to be assume positive intent, because we have to acknowledge that harmful stories tend to assume the worst about other people. And none of us want to be in a position where everyone assumes the worst about us. We're all better than the worst thing we've ever done. We've all messed up, but we don't want people assuming the worst. Because what negative assumptions do you think Kurt's making about his team, the two people? What's likely coming to mind is, that they just don't want to work hard. They don't get it. They're not on board. And that's what happens. The first time you try to assume positive intent, it's very hard to do this by yourself, especially when we're embroiled in these tough conversations. In fact, assuming positive intent means answering this question. Thinking about the other party and saying, all right, what positive outcome is this, key words here, smart, reasonable, conscientious person seeking, and why? Remember, we're not assuming the worst about people, because we're all created in the image of God. We've got to believe that we're all good. We're smart, reasonable, conscientious people. What positive outcome are they seeking and why? Now, when you first ask this question, here's when I ask this question in difficult situations, tough conversations, I tend to go negative first. Well, what positive outcome? They're stubborn. They're set in their ways. They just want what they want. That's the positive outcome they're looking for. They're lazy. They don't want to work. They disagree with the mission and vision. They want something else. And that's not the right answer to these questions. We might need help from somebody else to help us identify these things, somebody that can truly put themselves in the other person's shoes. Because if we get past the obviously not helpful story that's here on the left, we might think we're answering this question right, but we're still not. This one sounds better. They want it to be right, but they just prefer that I do the work. That's the positive outcome this smart, reasonable, conscientious person is seeking. Wait a minute. Okay, what about this one? Their priorities and theology are important to them. They want to do a good job, but they just don't catch details. They made those errors and made those mistakes. On the surface, this looks like assuming positive intent. But imagine I put these 3 bullet points in front of those other 2 individuals and say, does this accurately describe you? What are the odds they're going to say yes? Slim and none. Slim and none just walked in the building, right? They would likely recharacterize these. When we assume positive intent, we have to acknowledge that somebody has a good reason for doing what they're doing that is honorable. It's noble. It makes sense. Now, it may not make sense to us, but it makes sense to them, and they would nod and agree. Assuming positive intent will look like this. I assume that if I'm Kurt and having a conversation with somebody and assuming and then acknowledging positive intent, I'd say, I assume both of you just want efficiency, and doing a really detailed first draft where you dot every I and cross every T likely means more rework because I tend to suggest changes. They would probably nod agreement to that versus you want it to be right, but you just want me to do the work. Not really. All right. You really want to engage your audience and you know they like anecdotes. So you thought that food for thought anecdote would really be a grabber, and that makes sense. Yeah, they'll agree with that. Versus you got a different theology that's important to you that you want to get across here. Less likely. You want to be aligned, but you've heard conflicting messages. Yeah, we have this church vision and mission statement, but in some cases we'll make choices or do things that aren't quite aligned with that. And so there are some points where it's confusing to me. When you assume positive intent and acknowledge it, I've got to be able to write these bullet points down of what positive outcome you're looking for in a way that you would nod and agree with that. If we're on the opposite sides. So test yourself. Here are some examples, and your answers may not look like mine, but on page 4, read through the scenarios there and ask that question. There's a place on page 4. What positive outcome is this smart, reasonable, conscientious person seeking, and why? And then write down what you think that person's positive intent is, so that if they read it, they'd have no trouble agreeing with it. This is really changing the story in our head. And so we have 3 scenarios there on page 4: the challenger, the bulldozer. Notice we're trying to put a story in your head, and the interrupter, again, trying to put a story in your head. So pause, take a moment to write down what's their positive intent and what are the likely points of agreement that they have with the other person who's against the behavior they're seeing. What's their real positive intent? What's their noble intent? And what's the point of agreement? So pause, take a moment, and then we'll come back and discuss these. All right, so let's take a look at them. We're going to review the first person, the challenger. So this is the one, if you don't have the handout in front of you. In a recent session meeting, one of the elders was disrespectful in the way they disagreed with others about executing the plan for VBS, Vacation Bible School, this summer. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss how best to meet deadlines, not to discuss if we'd selected the best theme. And their response was inappropriate. So notice that paragraph right there is already loaded with negative story language, disrespectful, inappropriate. But what was their positive intent? Think about it. Maybe you had something like, this person wants to be sure that we as a church provide a high quality experience for kids coming to Vacation Bible School and for their parents. And they want to ensure the kids are fully engaged. And they don't want us to rush things. They likely feel like this decision was made quickly and it feels rushed, and therefore things may just be thrown together when we really need to be more intentional about this. Now, it's likely that the other party, the challenger in this case, would agree with that statement. You're absolutely right. This needs to be high quality. I want to make sure the kids are engaged, and I don't want to rush things. We're starting from our points of agreement. If I can acknowledge this positive intent and get the person nodding their head, that head nod that you get from somebody is an indication that they're open to hearing what you have to say, because you're listening to them without them even having to say these things. All right, what about the second one, the bulldozer? The bulldozer, longstanding member of the congregation, is a proponent of a project to build a new congregational life center. He drafted plans, drawings, including the budget, sent them out to all of the lay leadership asking for feedback. Unfortunately, there isn't a consensus that the congregation wants to expand the existing facilities, and some think he's intentionally trying to push through a controversial decision. All right, all of us can look at this and go, well, wait a minute, if I'm on the other side of this issue, can say, oh, there's a negative and there's nefarious business going on here. Now, if we're on this person's side, we'll go, oh yeah, it absolutely makes sense why you'd want to do this. We've all been on both sides of these debates, right? They want facilities. Now, what's their positive intent? They want the facilities to reflect the value and the spirit of the congregation. They want the church to have the resources it needs for ministry, the space, and they want to foster a sense of community. Imagine this space and what else it could be used for. There's a lot of need for space in our community. If I am against what this person is doing, but these words come out of my mouth, that's a powerful place to start the conversation. We are starting from points of agreement. This person will be nodding their head and say, yes, you absolutely understand what my intent is. Notice, but this requires us, if I'm not in agreement with what this person's doing, to change the story in my head. Because if you're not in agreement with somebody, you're typically thinking they're being selfish, self-centered, they're not a team player. They're, again, those harmful stories. It's all their fault. It's not my fault. All right, how about the interrupter? But you're all probably reading these and laughing because it's funny, but crying because it's true. These are common that come up, and we've probably been on both sides. The interrupter, staff member who consistently interrupts in meetings, criticizes the ideas of others, but the behavior isn't malicious, but it tends to bring judgment, negativity into the conversation. What's their positive intent? They want to make sure that all voices are heard in the decision process. They want to ensure we really think through all of our ideas. They've probably been involved in the past where not really vetting or being critical of ideas meant that there was rework, there was wasted effort. We went down a road and it was flavor of the month and we had to turn around. And they want to make sure we don't have any unforeseen setbacks. So it's really a gift that they're offering to bring up, here's some potential problems or potential. This is their positive intent. In the meeting, if we're experiencing this person, we may not think that they have a positive intent, but doggone it, they do. Smart, reasonable, conscientious individual. We got to believe, created in the image and likeness of God, as God is all-knowing, reasonable, conscientious, compassionate. It starts with the story in my head. These aren't easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. But I have to ask you to try it on your own. So instructions to set the foundation for yourself. Review your own tough conversation example. Acknowledge where you might have some bias and or some preconceived notions. And assume and acknowledge the positive intent and points of agreement. Can we start our conversation from a different place verbally and from a different place in our mindset? You may need help with this. In fact, you'll likely need help with this. It's hard to do this on our own when we are embroiled in this. When I'm doing this with a situation with one of my kids, spouse, other person in the workplace, I often need to get ideas from other. Help me out here. If you're in their shoes, what do you see? What's the good that's going to come out of this? Not just for you, but for everybody. Why is this a good business decision, a good church decision, a good spiritual decision? So take some time to do that for yourself. That's the homework. And then for your roundtable discussion, I'll give you homework for that as well. You're going to meet soon as a roundtable to discuss the content we've shared, your own tough conversations, and we've just scratched the surface, but would like to hear which of these strategies was most helpful to you. How did you employ them? What were the results? And What are some best practices for any specific scenarios you encounter in your roundtable? Perhaps you're coming with a question. Hey, I got this scenario. I would love some help on how to see this from all perspectives. Or maybe there's a common scenario that comes up and people have successfully navigated that and can give you some ideas and thoughts, because we haven't gotten to the actual conversation yet. But the next thing to do, compile a list of ground rules that you could share prior to having a tough conversation that could prevent challenges, encourage productive dialogue, and strengthen the relationship. What this means, and there's some samples on page 6 of, if we're going to have a tough conversation in churches, we oftentimes will have a prayer before this, which is really helpful. But sometimes we need more than that, which are some guidelines of, here's how this conversation is going to go. One of them that's listed there is paraphrase the point that somebody else makes. So what I'm hearing you say, or what I'm hearing is important to you, and I list that out, and I can't move forward and advocate for myself until the other person agrees that, yes, you do understand me correctly. You understand my intent. We've got to get those head nods before we can move forward. And then the last piece, write down any lingering questions you have that can be addressed in our second session on navigating tough conversations. Several months down the road, I'll come back via video, likely, with a second session, and would love to have a list of questions that came out of your roundtable discussion, or perhaps questions that you have about an upcoming conversation that you have. And we can address those specifically, give you some frameworks for the conversation itself to help you feel more confident, to dispel those myths that disagreements don't have to be bad. And we can't assume that everyone's going to be defensive, and that these really are an opportunity to strengthen relationship and move the kingdom forward. And for that, I'll ask for your continued blessings and pray success for you, and say thank you for letting me be a small part of this event for you. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to send me an email or a phone call, but I'll look forward to hearing what some of those lingering questions are for you. All right. All the best to you. Bye-bye.